Thank you, folks.
Hey, everyone. How's it going? I'm Shatakshi. I'm an investor on the growth team here at Sapphire. And thanks, Dave, for that warm intro. So maybe just setting the stage, right, for our discussion here. I think, given the continued economic uncertainty in our macro environments, companies are still right-sizing headcount, and there's a renewed top-down focus on efficiency, which means engineering managers are still being asked to execute on pretty aggressive product roadmaps, just with far fewer resources at their disposal. So, which means R&D optimization has become quite the topical subject these days, as engineering managers have to figure out a comprehensive set of metrics to measure developer productivity appropriately, allocate resources by analyzing these signals so that engineering effort is in line with the strategic objectives of their companies, and then also figure out a way to report this relationship between the R&D investment and the impact to the bottom line, right? So all of this is obviously easier said than done. So maybe with that context, like turning it over to you, Surabhi, given your time at Google, Airbnb, and now Robinhood, when do you, as an engineering leader, reach that moment where you realize, now we need to start defining engineering efficiency and adopting a set of metrics to accurately measure it?
Yeah, I'd say the best time to do it is now. You keep just increasing the fidelity of the metrics that you have. But I think that there's a lot more scrutiny, especially I think over the last year, on really figuring out are you getting the most you can out of the engineering team? Do you need more engineers to ship something new, or can you actually self-fund, right? Can you accommodate the work with the engineers that you have? How do you do more with less? And so the way I think of justifying that is really looking at a suite of metrics. So we have quality and velocity metrics. I think sometimes people focus too much on just velocity. And actually, an example is there was a team that actually was shipping quite a bit. Or a metric that I think was shared with me was that, hey, the same team right before a launch actually 3x's their output, right, in the days leading up to the launch. And you can rationalize this, but I think then people say, oh, does that mean there's a lot of slack in the system? And so I think it's important to get the full story of quality and velocity, because if you dig deeper into that story, what you actually find is that same team had a lot of bugs. Their unit test coverage was very low, right? And then they were relying on the QE team to catch a lot of the pre-production bugs. And so I think that just the more visibility and observability you have into where frontline teams are, I think it helps tell that full story. And then, the other piece to this is that sometimes people think okay, I'm going to think of one metric and really optimize for that. But I think some people kind of get very nervous with that, and I think it's important for people to understand that these are all diagnostic metrics. You don't want to optimize one specific metric, right? You want to understand where the blockers are, because it could be in the tooling, it could be in the developer experience, it could be a lot of product thrash, it could be that you're waiting on some approvals and those don't come, or the designs keep changing. And so there could be honestly problems all across the board. And so kind of figuring out how you think of all these metrics together to understand the problem just helps, I think, empower all eng leaders.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And we've seen several frameworks for improving the performance of DevOps teams emerge over the years. So there's DORA, there's SPACE, and now there's DevX. So maybe a question for you, Nathen, would be, how have these frameworks evolved over time, and how did they differ from one another?
Yeah, for sure. So we'll start with DORA. You know her, she's an explorer. It's really easy. You take 3 steps and you reach the end of the map. That's your DevOps journey. That's all you need to know. But maybe a little bit more seriously, when we think about DORA really started as this program and platform agnostic research into how do companies utilize technology. And that probably the most important finding of the DORA research program is that a team's ability or an organization's ability to deliver software is predictive of that organization's overall outcomes, the business of the business, if you will. Are you hitting your profitability goals? Are you having happy customers? Are you able to meet the promises that you've made to your customers in terms of things like reliability? And from those outcomes, we back up to how do we measure that? Well, to measure software delivery performance, DORA uses 4 key metrics. 2 for throughput, which are deployment frequency and your change lead time. So basically, how long does it take to get a change into production, and how frequently are you doing that? And so when we think back to your story about that team that 3x at the end of their sprint, well, they maybe 3x the output of stuff they were throwing over the wall to QA, but that wasn't really the measure that we were looking for. How does it get into production? We want to look at the full system. And then, so those are the throughput metrics, deployment frequency, change lead time. But then we have stability as well. When I push a change into production, what's my expletive rate? That's not what the researchers call it. We call it the change fail rate. But you know this rate. You push a change to production and someone shouts out an expletive because we have to roll that change back or push forward a hot fix. We want to keep those low. And then finally, we know that failure is going to happen. It's not a question of if, but rather when. And how does our team respond and restore service when we get there? So those are our stability metrics. Interestingly, we've also found in the research for almost a decade now that these metrics aren't trade-offs of one another. The teams that are good are performing really well across all 4, and the poorest performing teams perform poorly across all 4. Now, there are other metrics frameworks that are out there. How many of you have been measured or measure your teams today by the number of lines of code that the engineers write?
All day long.
Yeah. The best engineers in your organization, I just want to point out, they have a negative number for lines of code, because when you delete code, that's when you're being really productive. But there are other frameworks like SPACE, which is a little bit more general. It's more of a metrics framework than it is a technology framework. How do we get better metrics? And then things like DevX, which help drive that as well.
Okay. Yeah, no, super interesting, right? And so maybe transitioning a little bit here to how these concepts and frameworks are being applied in practice today by people. And maybe a question for you now, Andrew, is there's all these tools and platforms that have been built off these frameworks that have now come up. In your opinion, how do these add value to engineering leaders?
Sure. I'll actually touch back to some of the stuff that you both said, but I think if you look at the tools over the last probably 5 years, they've been evolutions that build on the work that people have already done, right? So I think a lot of you out there probably are actually doing metrics manually, right? You've got scripts you've actually collected. You actually look at deployment rates through dashboards you already have. And so you can really kind of accomplish a lot of this by looking at these tools, the tools you already have. Now, I think the thing that's evolved over the last 5 years is toolage has actually helped to automate those things, that you don't have to roll it every time, right? And I think end of the day, we all have jobs we actually have to do, and we can't spend every moment right maintaining our scripts in that case. So I think that's originally how these things actually manifested, which is enabling that part of it. But to touch back onto, I think something you said in the beginning, which is there's no master metric. I think you're implying that context matters. And I think if you just rattled off like DORA, SPACE, DevX, there's a huge plethora on this. And in the green room before here, we're kind of debating this discussion, and I challenge that actually metrics are culture. Now, that in itself might actually be, it's all how you define it, but I think traditionally we talk about culture, we think about, well, what do you value? How do you think about your team? Are they conversing? Is there respect? Do they like to be together? But I actually think what you respect actually applies to metrics too, because what you just said might add up to 50 metrics. Well, what do I do with that, right? And just like you said, you can't have one, you probably can't have 50 either,
yep.
Right? And so part of this process, I think all of us as leaders, is we still have to lead. We have to choose what matters to your organization, whether it's it's a say-do organization, so I really care about sprint commit rate, or it's actually deployment frequency, because that's what we care about. You have to figure out what those things are, and that's actually an important part of the journey to actually help choose what matters to your organization. And I bundle that into the discussion of culture for your technical culture, so that you can actually jump on these platforms and actually take advantage of them best.
I think you also have to look at what metrics matter and to whom, right?
Fair
Because
point, yeah.
you can definitely say, hey, developers, you get those deployment, you get that throughput. Hey, operators, you take the stability. Guess what happens? You start saying no to every change that he wants to ship. And then you win and you lose.
Yeah, I get no PRs.
Yeah. We have to share the accountability for those metrics.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then, I mean, speaking of like these frameworks and these tools that are being used to measure engineering efficiency, right? How are developers feeling about this? Like, I feel there's a there's often this kind of perception, big brother perception amongst your individual contributors. So I'm just wondering, and I would love to like hear all three of your opinions here, like how do you structure this data and your analysis from these signals in a way that doesn't cause friction with your individual contributors?
Wanna go first?
Everybody's looking at me.
Yeah, you first. Roll this way.
I think when you look at the suite of metrics, quality metrics, I think they are non-controversial, right? Everybody wants your engineering systems to stay up. You don't want to have incidents, all of that. I think it's the velocity metrics that start to become controversial. And I think there's a class of metrics specifically around, how much, if you start looking at how much code people are producing, I think that's where I think it's important to help people understand how and why. And so, the way we tackled it was we just actually told people that here are the metrics we're looking at. And for some of the metrics, we said that they are clearly diagnostic metrics. We're not going to change anybody's performance rating just based on this metric. If we think there's an outlier, we expect the manager to dive in and understand what's happening. There's probably a blocker. There's probably something going on that we need to kind of help and tackle. So I think we just tried to take an approach of transparency. Now, we actually dealt with this quite recently, so let's see how it plays out over the coming months. But I just, my personal philosophy at least is that, we do care about the overall picture, and let's just tell people about it. And so, yeah, it can be very controversial, I will tell you that. And so the worst thing you can do is you actually look at the metric and don't tell people about it.
Yeah, and engineers, we're going to engineer. We're going to engineer how do we win with the incentives that you've put in place. I'm going to game those metrics. And so I think it's really important that those engineers are part of that discussion around what metrics are we going to use, what are we going to care about. And with a framework like DORA, we go beyond those 4 metrics into the capabilities that drive those metrics forward. And we look at things like technical, process, and cultural capabilities. And so as a leader, I think it's fair for us to say, I'd like to see these 4 metrics improve, and team, you're the ones doing the work. How are you going to improve them? Which of these capabilities is holding you back? I'm going to give you the time and space to invest there so that we can see those metrics improve.
And I'll just layer on. I think, so a very tactical suggestion, start with teams first. I think individual metrics are where people get really wound up. So start with teams, use it as a way to diagnose which teams are stuck, right? Look at aggregate metrics there first as a starting point. But actually, I think you're hearing from all of us, involve your teams in the discussion what they are. Going back to my culture point, I can't pick your metric for you. You can't pick your metric for them. Like it has to be your organizations. Take your leaders aside and figure out what matters to your organization, because they will game it, to your point. But it's like if you care most about just getting lots of releases out, then great, they gamed it, right? Like that's what you achieved. So think thoughtfully about what you're trying to actually manage to and to what end. And the last bit I'll say is like, if you think about it from the individual's perspective, like what engineer wants to work on a company that doesn't succeed, right? So part of this is actually giving them a why to talk about, if we do this behavior at this rate, it actually helps us achieve this outcome as a business. And also, by the way, we actually can identify team health problems, right? Nobody wants that PR hanging out there for 6 days that no one's reviewing. Right, you're trying to actually help make a healthier environment so that people can accomplish their goals, which happens to be the business goals too. We all want to win, right? So let's make sure that we actually choose metrics that align where the engineer fits into the business.
Nice. I think, Andrew, you briefly mentioned this in the point that you were making. There's also, we've also heard of some of the challenges of just measuring, coming back to like to the engineering manager's perspective, right? There's some challenges with measuring engineering efficiency, be it the upfront work you need to put in standardizing Jira tickets, or just having to be mindful when you're comparing metrics, across different teams, like a front end or a back end team, or just teams with like different technical nuances. So, as practitioners, researchers, and thought leaders in the space, where would you say is the value, or like where these, what can you rely on these data sets for, and then where are the shortcomings?
Anybody want it?
I mean, we haven't used sort of a tool so far, at least. Like, I actually have some data science capacity to get a lot of these metrics, and I will just say that we keep iterating on them. We keep looking at the decisions that we're making. So, one example is the insights that you can get on your incidents, right? You can keep going deeper and deeper, right? So at the highest level, it's the number and the severity. But then, where are the SEVs coming from? Are they repeat SEVs? How do you know that you had a big incident, and how do you know for sure that in 3 months this is never going to happen, right? How many of them, you can classify your SEVs in different ways, and you can just keep going deeper and deeper. Is it a correctness SEV? Is it a financial SEV? Is it a tooling SEV? Like there's just, you can keep going deeper. So I think for us, I would just say that we just keep iterating on this. Like we go one level deeper, we figure out where the problematic areas are. Great, we get everybody up to a certain floor, and then we kind of go deeper.
Yeah, plus one to that, I think that using these metrics is sort of a signal to understand where are we on the journey. Like I step on the scale every morning and I see a number. And I'll be honest, I'm not very happy with that number from time to time. I want to change that. And I don't change it by just getting on the scale tomorrow. I have to change the things that I do. And so it takes reflection, and it probably takes, frankly, conversations across those cross-functional teams. Because at the end of the day, I really want our teams to focus on getting better at getting better, right? This is a journey of continuous improvement. And so we can use the metrics to sort of check in. How are we doing? And then let's invest in new practices, new capabilities, new ways of working, and then get back on the scale and see how has that impacted us.
A couple tactical commentaries. So you're hearing a thread consistently of you have to figure out where you're going first, and metrics are support on that part of it. Number two, don't use lines of code and don't compare story points across teams, right?
Yeah.
I think those are kind of givens on that part. There is also this picture of like really enabling these teams to understand, to embrace like this whole space. And that means that don't wait for perfect process, right? I think there's a thing here, you actually said, oh, there's preconditions for that. I actually say don't wait for that, right? Because I actually think it's okay to, like, look, as leaders at the macro scale you're all playing at, you're just directionally trying to get people in the right heading in this way. And so in some ways, to make them effective at this, start pointing them in a direction. Don't wait for a perfect year. Don't wait for perfect compliance on those things. Because the act of actually starting will actually get you towards that journey. Because these are all actions initiating a direction you want to go. And so if you wait for perfect process, it'll never arrive, right? And you're still stuck in the same spot. So recommendation there is like you don't need all the preconditions you just said.
Yeah, and some of those steps forward are going to feel like steps forward, but they're actually steps back. Yeah. And that's okay too. Just as Nora said this morning, let's learn from that. Let's invest in the learning so that we can take those lessons forward.
Actually, to add to something that Andrew said, I think that like on the process side, what's important is that you might say that we'll get the perfect view if everybody uses Jira and Coda, whatever your tool is, right? And I think driving an organizational change to get everybody to change their behavior and day-to-day work when they don't see the immediate value for themselves is a very hard battle to overcome. And so I think that it's important for the people that are using the tools that you believe are right, just show value. Like, why is it better? Like, what are they discovering through better tracking or the metrics that you're able to pull, and how does that help them and the broader organization? And so I don't know, sometimes you can just get in, just as other areas of software engineering where you say you get into like, is this language better than this language? Like, you just want to avoid those kind of debates and just start making progress and help people see light at the end of the tunnel.
Mm-hmm. Right, and then we were speaking about this a little bit more backstage, and I think this is like the last aspect of like an engineering manager's job, which is having to report all of this to the higher ups, right? So how do you think about bridging this gap between what an engineering manager, an engineering leader cares about, and then what resonates with the board? Essentially, how do you think about like mapping engineering effort with business outcomes?
Mind if I start this one?
Cool.
Yeah. Look, I actually think that most of us were trained as engineers. We spend 15 years learning to actually find the technical problems in things. And no one ever tells us that we actually have a different role as we actually step up into a larger role, which is you're there to actually bridge the business, right? And so I think you're talking about, I actually think there's the metrics and the way that you need to think about leading your team and the practice of what they do. But your role is also a translator, right? You need to communicate to the business. It's not just the board, by the way. It's the CEOs, it's your head of sales, it's the product leads, and those things. And they speak in business outcomes, right? And to really make your team successful, you have to translate them for that, right? And I'll go one further. It's not just translating. You actually have a duty and a responsibility to lead the organization. So we were just talking about just simple things like percentage of time spent on maintenance on product A versus product B. The rest of the business will never arrive that we should shut product B down in a fix, especially in this economy where people are largely flat headcount and they're dumping more stuff to do. Something has to give. But the business won't naturally know, they're like, oh, the maintenance cost of this one is too high. And so I actually think we have a job to do, which is match the costs or the metrics and to actually lead the business forward, because they won't arrive at the conclusion alone, and that's our chance to lead, right? So anyway, that's my addition to that.
A lot of the metrics we've talked about so far are for internal kind of consumption, right? Like the board expects everything to stay up and engineering to be productive. So one is that you want visibility into all of it, but you don't want to necessarily report on it. What I think about is how do we know the percentage of engineering that's allocated to product development, right? And sometimes you might be in times of a lot of debt, and so I think that's kind of one metric. I think that's helpful to show. The other is that for the bets that you are taking and the product development that you are doing, how do you know how much of it is successful, right? So your success rate for your experiments and how they drive the overall top-level company metrics. So I think the focus over there is a lot more kind of your OKRs and success of your product development process.
Yeah, and I think that context matters. I think that how do I know what I should report up to the board? Well, I should probably go listen to the board and ask some questions first. Try to understand what is their perspective and where are they coming from. Because if I don't know what goals they're after, I'm likely to report on something like, I don't know, how long a JIRA ticket stays open, and they'll never care about that.
The business of the business.
The business of the business.
I'm gonna make that
We have to know the business of the business.
Right.
That's our business. Stay out of my business. Sorry.
Speaking of efficient, we're right on time. And I know this was super interesting to me, and I'm sure to the rest of the audience as well. Thanks so much, guys.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.